Their transit was short as their ship began landing procedures. It jolted to the sides as the automated landing system engaged, tossing their occupants around if they weren't seated. He knew from experience aboard dropships and shuttles that a smooth landing was possible when free from confined spaces, but it was required for hangar landings to assist with pinpoint accuracy. It helped to maintain space in the hangar, and it was a quick process. When he felt the landing gears touch the deck, the ship lowered once more with a thud as the magnetic locks activated, effectively sealing it to the deck. The doors of the central compartment then opened, revealing a bright white light that filled the hangar, nearly blinding the Celian War Council, evidenced by their grimaced faces as their eyes slowly began to adjust. With himself in the lead, he disembarked from the ship and was met by a large crowd that gathered on the edge of the landing pad's boundary, with ship security placed along the perimeter. Much of the crowd were donned in colored mechanic suits that indicated their roles, and with their entry had gathered them. They looked upon them with wide eyes, with others discreetly trying to get photos, with several being hounded by security on operational security. From the crowd, they were parted, and he was shown a familiar set of faces. The first that stood out to him was Wolf, with a pair of Celians behind him, and a small detachment of his own men, most notably from Foxtrot Platoon. "Sir," O'Brien said as he came to attention, "mission accomplished. We have men on the ground securing the site, but I would like them to return to our carrier once they get replaced." "Granted. Once the Marines touch down, which they should have, your battalion will be free to return to your ship." "Now," said Wolf, "to whom do I owe the pleasure?" He spoke to the first in line, Reka, followed by Breka and Galam. "I am Reka, military advisor to the head chief," he replied, offering a slight bow. "These two are Breka and Galam, our Empire's lead logistical officer and diplomat, respectively. But while I may, can you usher Councilman Polis to a medical site?" Wolf turned to a pale Celian, with its right hand covered in stained bandages. He eyed O'Brien before calling for medical, to which the individual in question was taken and led by his own detail of ship security. When the individual was out of earshot, Wolf spoke. "What happened? Did he piss you off enough to blow his hand off?" O'Brien relaxed his posture as he replied, "Sort of. If you saw and heard what I did, well, you probably would have put an entire 8-gauge into his torso. He's lucky it was only his hand. That, and he was waving a gun around. I couldn't have him misfire and put one in the head of a VIP now, could I?" Wolf smirked to his reply, and then focused on the last Celian in the group. He looked to be at least twice the age, if not greater, than the surrounding councilmen. Before he could speak, the female Celian that previously took cover behind Wolf showed herself. The previous three were surprised at her sudden appearance, but she promptly ignored them, instead focusing on the quiet Galam. "Father," she said in soft disdain, "quite the nerve you're still alive." Galam sighed, his eyes resting to meet her gaze. "Yorla, for what reason are you aboard a Terran vessel, along with that failure of a commander?" he said, directing a sharp stare at the other Celian who had yet to present himself and chose to remain quiet. "We have seen what you ordered Torlak to do. Enslavement. We fought the Union to free ourselves from them, only for us to commit the same atrocity. We still have many of our own people still enslaved by them, and you went and did this?" Tears began forming in her eyes as she spoke. Galam remained silent, as he didn't have a rebuttal or excuse. He was at fault, and it had inevitably caused war which quickly turned to their disadvantage. To save him from any further dishonor, he decided silence. When she found that he wasn't going to respond, she turned to step away, finding her spot beside a man separate from the aged commander who greeted them first. He was younger, but still wore what he suspected to be naval uniform. Then he noticed it, an ornate headdress mixed with gold and silver, fashioned with expertly crafted flowers that sat upon a white cloth. "Since when?" he uttered, curious of her adornment. "When did you receive such a gift?" "A year ago," she responded. "We are betrothed, and with this war over, we will marry." Callum turned his gaze to the man who stood beside her, eyeing him in detail. "What is your name?" "Vale, but I'm afraid we won't be acquainted long." He gave a nod to the eyeful wolf, to which he ordered their confinement. "We'll have security escort them," said Wolf, and a set of guards surrounded the remaining 4 Sellians as they led them to the brig. The crowd had then slowly begun to disperse, eventually leaving the small group after Wolf dismissed the rest of security. "O'Brien, we need to talk privately," he said, turning to his entourage of the Sellian pair and lone commander, not minding his team as they had already set themselves to relax. O'Brien followed him to the ship his team disembarked from and closed the doors. The ship's engines were still off, so there was no hum to add to the ambiance. "What now, sir? I'd like to think my team is going to enjoy some much-needed leave," replied O'Brien. "You will, but we've received some troubling news. Sergeant Trisco from Viper's Kilo platoon was ambushed. They were operating a skeleton detail for transport when they stopped in a system to rendezvous with Senate forces for a send-off. He only had half a squad with him, but they were wiped out, save for him and the crew. The worst part, Torlak escaped. I'm sorry." It was an unwelcome surprise to O'Brien, and he was furious at the loss of his raiders. But he had new questions form at the report. "How? Sensors would have picked up an enemy ship transiting through their newly controlled space, right?" he rebuked, to which Wolf shook his head. "We don't have a lot of the details, but the captain of the ship reported that they had to do emergency repairs. That's when they were attacked. However, in the midst of that, the sergeant was kind enough to provide video of the enemy. Take a look." He retrieved a rectangular device and handed it to O'Brien when it started playing. It was a video played in the point of view of Sergeant Trisco himself when he was interrogating a Sellian that he didn't recognize. It was only the 2 of them present, so he turned up the audio. "Come on! You rancid piece of shit! Tell me what I need to know before I glass your sorry fucking world!" He held the scruff of his clothing, effortlessly lifting the Sellian. "You don't have that authority. You're just as low on the caste as that fledgling behind you," retorted the Sellian. "Oh yeah? You want to know who can? He's the biggest and baddest raider this side of the galaxy, and I'm willing to bet he'd nuke whatever hole your family came crawling out of. Best get used to glass, because when I find your family, I'll give 'em your regards." The Sellian tried to fight back, but Trisco proved too strong for him. Tears of anger fell from his contorted face as he denied the raiders' claims. You filthy Terrans! I hope the Union puts you down like the elders prior, Vecta. You will be nothing more than slaves like the others." Trisco was about to deliver a violent and powerful punch to the Sellian, with O'Brien unsure if he was going to hold back. But he stopped after a shake of the helmet feed gave him pause. He tossed the Sellian back into his confinement and sealed the door before issuing orders to the raider behind him. The following series of events occurred how he expected, at least initially. It was quickly turned against them when the door to the room opened, and bolts of light dashed through the corridor. Trisco, along with the subordinate, then looked to where the shots were coming from, which was from the door that led into the small hangar. There were already 2 dead raiders laid on the floor, motionless, as the volume of fire from the enemy increased. Trisco had assessed the corridor for any friendly forces, with only a couple further down, and in the prone position as they fired through the doorway and into the hangar. They were, however, unarmored, donning only their undersuit and fatigues with fresh bed hair. They had just woken up, but their first instinct was to fight, regardless whether they had their armor on or not, and yet they fought. However, it took a turn when the shooting stopped, and a large mass lunged through the door and swung at the sergeant with its large tail. It knocked him against the bulkhead, causing him to cry out in pain before going unconscious. From there, the only imagery was of the floor and numerous bodies, both human and alien. There was a stark difference with those in the video, however. They weren't Sellian. The video then cut to after he woke up, with an angered Sellian kicking at his body and cursing him. There was no presence of the alien threat, so it continued on with Trisco rising from the retreating enemy and recaptured the Sellian prior. He ended up catching the enemy with their backs turned and lifting the large reptile's body and the new corpses into the artificial tunnel cut into the hangar's door. The feed finally cut out after the raider placed the Celian back into custody and locked the doors to the hangar, leaving in the corridor fallen comrades whose blood pooled beneath them. It was a lot to unpack, but O'Brien understood the implications. "What are we dealing with now, besides the Runyan?" he said, his tone near unfazed. "Well, beyond the Runyan we don't know. This happened 6 to 8 hours ago, but the bodies were spaced when the boarding party left. They recovered them quickly, so we only have one other body. They're working the autopsy now, but we won't get results until they make it back to Sol," replied Wolf. "Very well," resigned O'Brien. "I take it 4th Fleet is going to return home?" "They will. They weren't our original replacement, so we'll head home once another carrier group arrives. The rest of the 7th will remain here until then." Wolf opened the door to the ship's compartment, removing their privacy, and continued, "In the meantime, set up a patrol roster. We're still going to need some guys planetside for cleanup duty." But as the door met the floor, a person whom O'Brien was unfamiliar with stood by with her own entourage of naval officers. Compared to Wolf, who donned a standard field uniform, she wore similar colored fittings, but over her thighs was a sturdy fabric skirt, or belt spat. Some even called it a command skirt, or kama. It was a new look, and he wondered if the uniform had changed sometime in the last 3 years. "Ah, Dad," she spoke, meeting the Vice Admiral in a bear hug once he stepped off the ship's ramp. "Zuna, my dear, brilliant display. Never have I seen a ship get torn from a slipspace rupture like that. I think you were lucky to be granted such a magnificent ship," added Wolf, his tone now reflective of a doting father. The woman before him was young and had wavy platinum-brown hair tied into a braided ponytail, its length reaching just below her nape. To him, it looked like a fluffed foxtail with the amount of volume it had, bounding with each head movement and step. O'Brien couldn't help but stare. "May I help you, Raider?" she said in a soft tone. She seemed to be no older than his sergeants, specifically Strega, as they shared similar complexions, just without the scars. "Ma'am," he said, offering a slight nod. His helmet was still on, but as he looked her over, he noticed that she bore 3 bars and a star on her shoulder. She was a commander, and at a relatively young age than he had ever seen. "Didn't think I'd meet a commander as young as you." He reached his hand out, to which she replied in kind. "I thank my father for his teachings," said Zuna. "Well, I must be off. 4th Fleet has almost wrapped up its support, so we'll make our way to Sol, and we can begin preparation for the tribunal. Maybe I'll see you there, O'Brien." She turned, leaving the 2 beside the aircraft. After she was out of earshot, he removed his helmet. "Is she seeing anyone?" he asked of his superior beside him. He continued to stare at her as she left, but he received a slight nudge from the elbow of his officer. "No. She only wants the best, and none have come close to her expectations. But you practically assaulted an enemy's capital city by yourself and captured their leaders. I'd say you have a pretty decent chance. That, and she even suggested you meet again. I hope you're free that day," commented Wolf in an endearing manner. It was a tone O'Brien was unfamiliar with, but found it to be a welcome one. Then, once he had concluded their meeting, had the rest of his team depart for their home, the arm of Sol,